In today's lesson, we're going to talk about a concept called interleaving. And you might be wondering, what could interleaving possibly mean? And I'll explain it all. It's actually a really cool research-driven principle that can make us better teachers no matter what classroom and what students we are working with. In order to do interleaving, it's helpful if we revisit what we learned in the previous lesson about active recall and all the pieces around that. So sit back for a couple minutes first, and I'm just going to kind of walk through with a spoken talk through of what we kind of covered in the previous lesson about active recall. So active recall, if you remember from the previous lesson, is the idea that when our brain is trying to remember stuff it's learned or explain stuff it's learned, that's a very powerful part of the learning process. It's actually this struggle to recall and struggle to remember and struggle to explain that is really what makes the connections in our brain really strong and helps cement the learning and make it something that we won't forget that easily. Now, related to that is the concept of the testing effect, which doesn't mean that you should take big tests all the time or you should give tests all the time if you're a teacher. But what it means is testing ourselves, quizzing ourselves, forcing ourselves to explain things we kind of half understand is a great way and a much more effective way for us, the brains, to learn than it is if we just have the answers in front of us and review. So the example we give often when you hear this is, instead of just reviewing your notes and just looking through your notes, right? Cover up parts of your notes and say if you can you remember the part that's under it? Or if you've got parts of your notes that explain a concept, put the notes away and just walk through in your voice and talk through what you remember for that. So it's this quizzing of ourselves, the testing of ourselves that forces our brain to recall what we know, that makes the learning stronger. Now, related to this, and they all kind of go together, was the idea of desirable difficulties. By removing the answers and forcing our brain to come up with these answers, we're making the learning more difficult, but we're helping the brain to cement those connections and make everything stronger. So active recall, quizzing ourselves, testing ourselves on what we know, explaining things we're not sure, makes it more difficult. And it's that difficulty and struggle that's an important part of the learning process. A good analogy that sometimes I'll use is, imagine that you're trying to get in good shape and you're going to go 4 miles today. And so you go out the door and you're like, okay, I'm going to cover 4 miles today. And you get like 100 yards down the road and a friend drives by in their car. It's like, hey, you want to ride? You're like, okay. And you hop in the car and they drive you the 4 miles. Well, you went 4 miles, right? And it was super easy. And you're like, wow, I covered 4 miles. But it's that running, it's that struggle that builds our body up, that helps us to get into good shape. Obviously, that's an obvious example that the idea that, sitting in a car for 4 miles isn't going to get you in good shape. But it's the same thing that happens in learning when we just sit there with the answers and the questions in front of us. It's taking away those answers, quizzing ourselves, forcing our brain to remember. It's that struggle that makes the learning. Lastly, in the previous lesson, we looked at spaced versus mass retrieval. And this is the idea that forcing those recall events, right? So when you're studying, spreading them out is much better than cramming them together. So studying 5 days a week for something for an hour a day is better than doing 1 5-hour session in a day. Likewise, in a day, if you can spread out your learning sessions, and when you're quizzing yourself on those recall sessions, spreading that out in a day is better than doing one session at a time. And that brings us to interleaving. And interleaving is connected to this idea of struggle because interleaving actually does make the learning more difficult and stronger. Let me explain, first of all, what it is. So interleaving basically means the blending of learning concepts together. Inter is among and leaving is the kind of leaves. You're putting things together and mixing things up a little bit. A good example of this, a great way to understand this, is if we think about math. We think about the 4 basic principles of mathematic calculation: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now, not interleaved, when you're not interleaving something, you're going to learn about math, and you're going to learn about addition, then you're going to take a test on addition. Then you're going to learn about subtraction, and you're going to take a test on subtraction. And then you're going to learn about multiplication, and you're going to take a test on multiplication. Then you're going to learn about division, and you're going to take a test on division, and then you go on and learn something else. That's completely non-interleaved, right? Each of the 4 things were separate from the other. Interleaved would look like this. You learn about addition, then you take a test on addition, right? You see how you do. Then you learn about subtraction, and you take a test on subtraction. Then you take another test with addition and subtraction mixed together on the same test. You're now interleaving the concepts, weaving them together, because what's really important in learning, especially when we think about how we use these things in real life as opposed to in a school, is these things are going to come together at us in different ways in real life. Things are going to be all mixed up in real life. So once you've got a concept down, you're good. Once you got that other concept down, then put them together in the same challenge and see if the brain can figure out, when do I subtract things? When do I add things? Then the third way, continuing on, then after that, you might learn multiplication, take a test on multiplication, and now your next test goes addition, subtraction, and multiplication all mixed together. Research shows that when students learn in a non-interleaved way, they feel like they're doing better, but when you test them on it at the end, they actually do a lot worse. If you interleave concepts, students get a little bit more confused and they feel like they're not learning better. But then if you were to test them on all three of those concepts at the end of the course, the students who had the interleaved content did a lot better. Now, of course, it's not you want to be careful. This isn't something where you say, okay, you should teach like addition 5 minutes, subtraction 5 minutes, multiplication 5 minutes, and teach all three things at the same time. That's not what this is saying, right? It's saying it's a thoughtful process. You're going to do addition, check on that, subtraction, check on that, and then intentionally have a section where you mix these things together. And this applies to anything that we're teaching. It could be history, it could be science, where you learn some new concepts or some new principles in science, and then you say, okay, now we're going to go back and revisit these other things we know. We're going to mix these all together and see if your brain can figure out which one applies to this different particular problem. So interleaving is a hugely powerful concept in education. It's one that oftentimes textbooks and classes don't do very well, but it's a great way to help our students develop real school skills that they're going to be able to apply in the real world.